Hello, welcome to Spiritual Psychotherapy Services. I also have an organization called Spiritual Sciences Society, but this is the YouTube channel of Spiritual Psychotherapy Services. My name's Dr. Thomas Housh, or Housh, depending on how you'd like to pronounce it. And I'm speaking, although without the video, unfortunately, we couldn't get the video working, with Boris Langer. And did I pronounce your family name correctly? Is it Langer or Langer or?
In German it would be Langer.
Langer, okay,
Langer.
That's what I thought. So this is our first session together. So the first thing I'm going to do is tell you what I do as part of my psychotherapy services, and we'll take it from there. So I'm based in Perth, Australia, and I've been a psychotherapist for several years now. I'm quite old, as you can see, no hair. And I practice what is called transpersonal psychotherapy. So transpersonal, what does that mean? We hear the word trans a lot. The word trans means change, or to move from one place to another, as in transport and transfer, etc. So transpersonal means to go beyond or to move beyond the personal. So in transpersonal psychotherapy, we're not focused so much on the day-to-day problems that we go through, which we all go through. It's focused more on going beyond those problems, transcending, in other words, another word with trans in it, transcending the personal. And what I mean by personal I'll go into later maybe, but just for now I'll tell you more about transpersonal psychotherapy. So transpersonal psychotherapy began, it's actually quite ancient, but in the modern world of psychology and psychotherapy, it began in the 60s, somewhere around the mid-60s, late 60s, and became more popular in the 70s. And the most famous transpersonal psychotherapist or psychologist is probably Alexander Maslow, whose family came from Kiev in Ukraine, or I think it was called Russia then, part of USSR maybe. And he was a Russian-American psychologist. He's quite famous actually because he devised the so-called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Needs, it's N-E-E-D-S, needs. So Boris, have you heard of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes, I have.
So can you tell me anything about that?
Yeah, I think there are 4 or 5 layers, I don't remember. But yeah, basic needs, I think food, shelter, security, and then it goes up to
self.
Top, I think it's
self.
Self-realization or something like
that.
Yeah.
Or Maslow uses the phrase self-actualization. And when I first studied psychology in 1983, I was quite fascinated. That's the main thing I remember from my early days of psychology studies at the university in Perth here, was the term self-actualization. I was very, very fascinated by that. And although at the time I was not interested in religion or spirituality at all. Anyway, so you're quite right. So you understand what I'm talking about here. I don't need to explain that any further. So in transpersonal psychotherapy or psychology, it's a very holistic form of psychology. It's quite different than other types of psychotherapy, such as cognitive behavior therapy, which basically is changing your attitude towards your circumstances. And as I said earlier, transpersonal psychotherapy or psychology is actually very ancient, but it's only been incorporated into the academic sphere of psychology in the last 50 years or so, like I said, in the 60s, etc. And so it's, as I said, it's a holistic system. So it covers all aspects of one's life, such as diets and general outlook, psychological outlook. On I'll get more specific. But my actual specialty is something which is extremely narrow. There's only a couple of psychotherapists in the world that would probably do what I do exactly, and I'm going to get into that right now. It's going to be a bit of a shock to the average person. I'm not sure how you're going to take it, Boris, but I'm going to just spit it out, so to speak. So my psychotherapy, or spiritual counseling, if you want to put it that way, because transpersonal psychotherapy is just another word for spiritual counseling, really. That's why I call my organization Spiritual Psychotherapy Services, or I could have called it Transpersonal Psychotherapy, but I chose Spiritual Psychotherapy Services because it's a SSS sound, it's an alliteration. So I'm going to, as I said, spit it out, and my therapy or spiritual counseling is based on the notion that suffering and pain are quite distinct, although there is some overlapping there, but pain and suffering are rather distinct. They're not exactly the same, although there's also a blending, as I said, between the two. So I'm going to define what suffering and pain is, and explain how I, in my own life, have overcome suffering, and how there's only one way that you can truly overcome suffering. And so I'll just start, as I said, with the definitions. So actually, since I'm speaking so much, I'll ask you, Boris. Can I call you Boris, or is it Mr. Lunger?
It's okay. Boris is fine. Boris
okay.
Is fine.
Oh, you're still there. That's good. So, Boris, I'll ask you the questions. Do you see any distinction between pain and suffering? And if you do, then can you just give a very, very brief definition between the two, pain and suffering, and then I'll explain what I mean by the two.
Yeah, I would say there is a difference. Like, for me, pain is like, physical pain, or also emotional pain related to trauma, and suffering is like more a psychological or mental idea about the pain that it, If you make a story like out of if you hurt your leg, for example, on a physical level, I think it's more clear. And if you cut your leg off, and then there's of course pain. And I would say the suffering is if you every day, I have no leg, and like these ideas, the mental ideas about pain, I would say it's suffering.
Okay. That's very good, actually. Do you mind if I ask you where you got those ideas from? Was it any particular teacher, or just after many years of studying these things, these concepts?
Maybe there's a guy that comes to my mind. I don't know if he really said this in these words, like Jeff Foster. Maybe you're familiar with him. Like,
yeah, I know of Jeff Foster. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to give you my definitions, which is very similar to what you said. As far as pain is concerned, there are three forms of pain. the two that you mentioned, which is physical pain, like as you said, chop off your leg or arm, feel pain there. I've had my right wrist was broken once, and I had excruciating agony when that happened. And so physical pain, we all know what that is. No need to explain what physical pain is. Then the emotional pain, like somebody that you are close to dies, emotional trauma, like you mentioned, emotional pain. There's also another one, though, which is rather difficult to understand or accept superficially, but I can explain what that is. It's financial pain. So superficially, you might think that financial pain, like if you lose money, that's emotional. It affects you emotionally, but that's not necessarily correct, because if you're very rich and you lose $10 or some small amount, it's not necessarily going to affect your life in any noticeable way. Obviously, if you're a millionaire and you lose $10 on the street, or pay too much for an item which could have been cheaper at the next shop next door, then that's not going to hurt you emotionally. You're just going to just not give it any thought, any second thought. But it's actually painful for your finances. Objectively speaking, it's painful. So we're not going to talk much about the financial pain, because that's not such an important one. But they're definitely the two most common forms of pain: of physical pain, which we all have sometimes throughout the whole day and into the night in some cases, unfortunately. And that's one of the tragedies of this world, the first noble truth in Buddhism, that life is suffering. But actually suffering is quite distinct from pain. As you said, suffering is more of a intellectual thing. So I'll give an example of how pain and suffering are distinct. So pain, for example, the one that I normally give is when I was a child, I could have been abused by my mother or father or someone in the family or relative, etc. So I was physically, sexually, emotionally, whatever, abused as a child. So it was very painful at the time. So I could have been physically abused, I could have been emotionally abused as a child. But now that I'm 50, 60, 70 years of age, that pain has long gone into the distant past. But if I'm still thinking about that, oh, my mother, she was so bad to me, and I was abused, and woe is me, and I hate her so much, and etc., 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 that's the true, correct, accurate definition of suffering. Because we all experience pain and pleasure, of course. And there's also a fine line between the two, of pleasure and pain. But we don't necessarily need to suffer the intellectual machinations that go afterwards, that are in the so-called horizontal. So the pain happened at one time. Let's say I broke my arm, like I mentioned, and it was painful for, let's say, 2 days. But now, after 20 years, if I'm still thinking about that time, oh, I'm so angry at that person for breaking my arm, and I wish the doctor in the hospital wasn't so nasty to me, etc., etc., etc. That's the true suffering, which is not necessary. But we all do that. We all experience suffering, and there are 5 symptoms of suffering, which I'll go into a bit later on. And the cause of suffering is the thing which I mentioned, where I said I'm going to spit it out, because it's quite radical and confronting. So here we go. Get ready for it. The cause of suffering is the belief, the false belief, that humans, and also other animals too, but in this case humans, have free will or freedom of volition. So when we believe, as I said, falsely believe, that humans have free will, or that we are the doers of our actions, the ultimate doer, then we automatically experience the 5 forms of suffering. Like I mentioned, blaming others for what they did to us, like blaming my mother when I was a child, blaming the doctor in the hospital for being nasty to me, which actually happened in one case. And we also feel guilty for what we've done to others, or even done to ourselves. So that guilt is a form of suffering due to the fact that we believe that we have freedom of volition or free will. And there's also another one, the third one. As I said, there's 5. So the third one, I mentioned guilt, blame. The third one is pride. If we feel pride, or we are proud of what we have done something good or beneficial or spectacular, then that is a form of suffering actually. It's hard to believe, I know, but I can go into that later. The fourth one, which is a very, very common one, is anxiety. When we are anxious about things happening, especially in the present time, that's a form of suffering. And the final form of suffering is expectations about the future, and also regrets about the past. So now that I've spat out the hard teaching, which I mentioned, the very radical and confronting, this is very confronting what I'm saying. It goes totally against what every human being in the history of this world has believed, almost every human being anyway. So now that I've said that, what do you initially think about that, Boris? Do you think it sounds crazy, or?
Actually, I'm familiar with this. I'm following like a lot of non-duality speakers, and
right.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Okay. Unfortunately, very, very few of the non-duality teachers, like the one you mentioned, they actually talk about this. There are a couple, so do you mind if I ask you which one that has taught this lack of free will, or lack of, or non-doership notion?
Andreas Müller from Germany.
Right.
Actually, I already invited him, and there is a resonance with this message, but it's not. I think there are two. It's a difference between I intellectually understand what Andreas is saying or what you are saying, but I think there is a difference between like intellectually understanding it and like if we really realize it in a deeper sense.
Right. So what you said is correct, Boris. So the only way we can realize this is to study it scientifically. So as I mentioned at the very, very beginning of this video, of our chat, I have an organization called Spiritual Sciences Society. So I call myself a spiritual scientist, and because spirituality is not only a science, but it's actually the greatest science. In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Sri Krishna calls it Raja Vidya Raja Guhyam, which is king of sciences or king of knowledge, or the greatest science. So it's actually a scientific fact that life, that this world, this universe is preordained and there is no free will, everything is determined. That's a scientific fact which most physicists and most academic philosophers accept. But the big problem is, unless we fully have realized this by, first of all, studying it scientifically and then putting it into our lives, we cannot overcome suffering. So I'll give you one example. There is one amateur philosopher who has a YouTube channel, and he 100% believes that we don't have free will, that everything is determined. because he has studied this matter very scientifically. He's a very intellectual man. He has a high IQ, maybe around 150 or more. But unfortunately, because he hasn't gone through maybe what I'm talking about now, the psychotherapy aspect, he hasn't been trained, in other words, he hasn't been taught properly how to overcome his suffering. He experiences a lot of depression and suffering. So the two things are very important to, first of all, understand intellectually that there is no free will, that everything is preordained or determined or fatalism, whatever you want to call it. And the other aspect is to incorporate that understanding into your life so you can become free of suffering, which is what I said earlier, the 5 forms of suffering, the 5 symptoms of suffering, which is again blame, or let's start with ourselves, guilt for what we've done, blaming others, pride, anxiety, and expectations for the future, or expectations for outcomes. So if something doesn't go our way, we become upset or angry or whatever, because we believe that things could have been otherwise. So speaking now for 1 hour during this chat, when there's no way in the universe you're going to fully accept the notion of determinism, or maybe you will, but even if you do, it's only because you've been studying this notion, this concept for maybe many months or years. But normally it takes quite a long time, maybe months or years or even decades, to fully intellectually understand this concept. Maybe if you're a physicist, you studying at university, or a doctor of physics, quantum physicists, or maybe not so much a quantum physicist, because quantum physics actually says that randomness is a thing, which I won't go into at all at this time. But anyway, so there's a process, as I said, a scientific process where one can learn and understand how there is no free will, everything is determined, and that's what will happen over the next few weeks if you decide to continue this, and over the next few months and maybe years. But as you learn more and more about the scientific notion of determinism, you can also incorporate the other aspect, which is the overcoming of the suffering at the same time. So I'll give you a technique right now which will help you to do the second part of what I'm talking about, the overcoming of the suffering. And you can call it what you want, but the most common, one of the most common phrases which is used for this technique is to rest as awareness. So what do you think I mean by resting as awareness? What does that mean anything to you, Boris, or is it just totally meaningless?
That's a little resistant, because I tried this techniques, but I'm not a master, or what I think about it is like this idea that there is a layer in your consciousness that is like an observer, or like a background, like the screen of the, when we are looking at the display, there's a screen and there's content. I can see you, you can't see me, unfortunately, but yeah. And then like the awareness would be like the screen, and the content would be maybe the conscious mind or something.
Yeah. So what you're talking about there is the notion of awareness. But what would you think that I was referring to if I used the term resting as awareness? Does that mean anything to you?
I guess that is like an internal movement in your mind and body, or like to try to get prior to the body sensations and the thoughts. That is my idea about it, what resting in awareness means, like
Right.
that you see that you are not identified with the emotions and the thoughts and the body sensations, but you like try to step back a bit and observe like the body sensations, the emotions and the thoughts. That's my idea about resting in awareness.
That's quite good actually, Boris, but I wouldn't use the term observing. When you use the term observing, that's not really doesn't really come into what I'm talking about. I'll use another phrase. So another way of putting resting as awareness would be, the one that I normally use, is regressing to one's inner self or innermost self. So the word regressing means to go back, regress, to move backwards. And the innermost self is something I'm going to explain now. So, do you understand the notion of subject-object duality? Subject and object.
Yeah, I would say usually if you're a human being, you experience the world like you are the subject, the doer or the victim, and what's around you are objects, or of course usually you'll see other people also as like not as an object, hopefully. If you're sane enough, you can sense that they are subject also, and that but there is a kind of it is you sense that, or you in your perception that other people are outside of you, and
Okay, that's pretty good. So just one very small thing I would say about that, which I won't say much about, is that when we look at another person, that person is an object to us as a subject. But as I said, I'm not going to go into that. That's another story. But I will explain. The most important thing we need to understand about the subject-object relationship is that there are levels of subjectivity. So I'm going to go through the levels of subjectivity so we can get to the innermost level of subjectivity, which is what I would call the true self. You can call that soul or God or awareness or consciousness with a capital C, or spirit, or Atman if you're into the Sanskrit language, or Pali. So when we look at the external world, now I don't know what you're looking at now because I cannot see you, but let's assume that you're looking at your telephone, or
I'm
looking
at you, at my telephone.
Oh, yeah, okay, yes. So you're looking at me, so obviously I'm just looking at a black screen here. I'm actually trying to look into the camera more so you can see my eyes. So anyway, so you're looking at image of myself on your telephone screen. So that image is going into your eyes through the optic nerves into your brain, and your brain is interpreting that in a very marvelous way, which neurologists don't quite understand yet. It's brain science is in its very much in its early stages. So there's a hard problem of consciousness which has yet to be solved. Have you heard the phrase hard problem of consciousness? It's a very common phrase in the spiritual world, in the philosophical world especially. Anyway, so when you look at your telephone screen there, Boris, your mind which is composed of images, elementary thoughts, and sounds, and smells and tastes, the sensory. So you maybe you can smell something there in your room. You can obviously feel something. You're touching something now, obviously. Even if you're just standing up in the room, you're still touching the floor. So anyway, these sensory perceptions are contained within the mind, and the mind is the subject, and the external world are the objects. Like, as I said, even someone else that we're looking at, another person, is an object. And so how do we know that we have a mind? How do we know that we have a cognitive faculty which can see, smell, taste, and hear, etc.? We know that because we have something which most animals do not have. We have an intellect which is composed entirely of conceptual thoughts. So because we are the most intelligent animal, at least on this planet, we know that we have a mind. We know that our mind might be thinking of this or thinking of that, or actually that's really the intellect, but we know that the mind can see things. We know our mind is dreaming something when we sleep at night. We know that our mind is tasting something. We know that the nose doesn't smell. We know that the nose is just a mechanical device for transferring odor to the brain, as I said, in some quite a miraculous way, very miraculous fashion. So the intellect is the subject in this case, and the mind is the object. So I know, or let's say my intellect knows that I have a mind. So my intellect, my conceptual thoughts, know that I have a mind. So if I said to you, Boris, do you know that you have a mind? You will say, yes, hopefully.
My thoughts are telling me. There are thoughts appearing that I have a mind.
Yeah, and those thoughts are intellectual, conceptual thoughts, and so you know that you have a mind. So in this case, the mind is actually that intellect is actually the subject, and the mind is the object. So I'm sure you understand this quite clearly, but there is another layer of subject-object duality, and that is how do we know that we have an intellect? So that faculty is called the ahamkara in Sanskrit, which is usually translated as ego, although it's actually a very poor translation. The word ahamkara or hamkara literally means I, doing I. Aham means I, or I am, and kara comes from the same root as the word karma, which karma means action or doing or work. So ahamkara means doing the I. So if I said I have an intellect, what is the faculty that knows I have an intellect? That is the ahamkara, the so-called ego, which is better translated as pseudo-ego, or sometimes false ego, but I use the phrase pseudo-ego. So the ahamkara or pseudo-ego knows that we have an intellect, and the definition of ahamkara, as I said, is doing the I, but in practical terms it means adding any noun or adjective after the I am. So if I said I am a man, or I am a woman, or I am young, or I am old, or I am intelligent, or I am dumb, that is ahamkara working, the so-called ego or pseudo-ego. So unfortunately, not only is ahamkara mistranslated as ego, but the word ego itself is misinterpreted in religious spiritual circles to mean pride or haughtiness, so or arrogance, which is a secondary definition, but it's definitely not the most important or first definition, primary definition of the word ahamkara or ego. So the ego in this case is the subject which sees the object or perceives the object, which is the intellect. So as you can see, there's several stages of, or levels or layers of subject-object duality. And there's one more. And can you guess what that is? I already told you a few minutes ago. So Boris, what do you think is the perceiver of the ahamkara or pseudo-ego?
The awareness?
Right. And awareness in this case can also be equivocated or equivalent to the words I mentioned earlier, such as spirit or self with a capital S, soul, or even God. When most people use the term God, they may be thinking of a man in the sky or a blue Indian boy or whatever, but actually the most authentic definition of God is what I mentioned, is the true self, capital S self, which is the awareness or the capital C consciousness. So the true self perceives the pseudo-ego. So when we say I am, or I am, that is the true self. As long as we know what that true self is, of course. Like if anyone can say I am, but they don't. When most persons in the world say I am, they're talking about the body-mind complex. But now you can see by what I mean by I am is the true self, which precedes the hamkara. So if I said I am a man or I am old, that is going beyond the I am. So just stick with the I am, that's regressing to the true self. And the technique that I mentioned, resting as awareness or regressing to the true self, is a technique for overcoming suffering. So when we experience the 5 forms of suffering, such as guilt, blame, pride, anxiety, etc., if we regress to the true self, like to give an example, I'm feeling very anxious now. Anxiety is happening. So then I just take a step back, regress to the true self, and just focus on the I am. Maybe breathe in and out slowly. Breathe in I, breathe out am. Just silently. We come into contact with our true innermost nature, our true self. And we come to, the more we do this throughout the day, the more this becomes a normal way of living. So obviously we all experience suffering, the 5 forms of suffering which I mentioned, the 5 symptoms of suffering. So the more that we regress to our innermost self when we experience suffering, the more it will become a habit, a good habit, and we can eventually overcome all suffering. And this has worked in my own life because the more I've been practicing spirituality of some kind, spiritual practices for several decades, and it wasn't until I came to learn of this technique and to practice it in my daily life, I finally overcame all forms of suffering. So I don't feel anxious about my life. I don't worry about paying the bills, even though I might be very poor. I don't regret things which I did in the past because I know that nothing could have been otherwise considering the circumstances, because we don't have free will, everything's determined. I know that for a fact because I've been studying these concepts for several years, and I know by studying physics, psychology, philosophy, etc., that there is no such thing as free will. Everything is determined to the nth degree. Even quantum randomness is determined, but unfortunately most physicists haven't realized that yet. There's only one or two, there's actually three physicists who are studying superdeterminism, one of whom I know, Sabine, actually from your country. She's actually German, a German physicist. She's a theoretical physicist, Sabine Hoffenfelder, and she's trying to prove that even quantum indeterminacy is actually determined, and she uses the term superdeterminacy or superdeterminism for her concept. She's working on that almost full time now. Anyway, so getting back to the big problem that we have in life is suffering. As I said, we can overcome all suffering by, first of all, understanding the concept that there is no free will, that we are not the doer of our actions, not ultimate doer. We are not the author of our actions. And the second part of that is to practice a method in order to make that a reality in our daily life, so that we never blame others for what they've done to us. Like, for example, in my life, I've had, just like everybody, of course, I've had other persons who have hurt me in many ways, physically, financially, emotionally. But I have absolutely, and I really do mean this, I've absolutely not the slightest blame at all for anybody in the past, or hopefully in the future too, who has hurt me in any way. I don't feel guilty for what I've done to others, because I know it couldn't have been otherwise. That doesn't mean that I intentionally do evil things to others, of course not, but if I do something now or in the future which has unintentionally hurt another person, I know that nothing could have been otherwise. So if I'm driving my car and I hurt someone or run over a cat or accidentally hit another person, of course I might feel some guilt initially, but that guilt is not prolonged in the horizontal timeline. So I might feel guilty for a few minutes, and then that guilt will turn into peace. I know that maybe I ran over a cat in my car, but it couldn't have been otherwise given the circumstances. Of course, I didn't deliberately run over the cat, so I wouldn't feel guilty for that. And as a strict vegan, I would never hurt another animal intentionally without good, just cause. So, do you have any questions about what I've just said, Boris?
No.
So we have about 5 or 10 minutes to go. Do you think that technique which I taught you is beneficial, or do you think there is a more beneficial method of overcoming suffering from your experiences?
I'm not, this is a method over via the intellect. What I tried in the past was also, of course, trying in therapy. I also tried like more body orientated things like somatic experiencing and stuff like that. And
actually, what I'm talking about has very little to do with the intellect. It's transcending the intellect. So let's give, as I said, I'll just give another example. So like I mentioned, if I hurt another person, I might feel guilty for a few moments, and then I might think to myself, this guilt is as a symptom of suffering. I don't want to suffer anymore. I know that what I did was unintentional. I know that I couldn't have done otherwise, because I know for a fact that there is no free will. And I know that the way to overcome this suffering is to regress to the true self, or to rest as awareness. So that part of it is intellectual, of course it is, and actually only a person with a certain level of intelligence can actually, practice what I'm talking about. Those who have very low intellects can very rarely overcome their suffering, because to overcome suffering means to understand, first of all, that there is no free will, which is quite an intellectual concept. And although in theory it is possible for those with a low intellect to overcome suffering by other methods, such as bhakti yoga, devotion to God. So like someone like Mother Teresa, for example, she wasn't very intelligent in my estimation, but if she was always praying to God and, oh, Lord Jesus, I love you, and give my heart to Jesus, etc., etc., that's one way of overcoming suffering. Although it's very rarely can overcome suffering fully, because it's always possible for a person like that to fall into suffering at some points in their life without understanding what is causing the suffering. So when you know that the suffering is caused by your belief in or false belief in doership, then it's more easy to overcome the suffering. So what I'm talking about is intellectual, yes, but when you get to the stage where you're resting as awareness, you're transcending the intellect. You're not thinking about, oh, I shouldn't have done that, what I did was wrong, and I blame this person, I blame you for what you did to me. You don't feel anxious about paying your bill next month or next week, because you're resting as awareness. And so you might say, well, you cannot do that 24 hours a day, and that's why I mentioned this technique is to be practiced at certain times of the day where you know that you are experiencing the 5 forms of suffering, or even if you're not experiencing suffering, you can still do it as a practice. So this practice is meant to get to the level where you don't need to practice any longer. That's why it's called a practice. So if you are the greatest pianist in the world, you need to practice every day. When you get to that level of being the greatest pianist in the world, you might not need to practice so much. Of course, you still do. That's probably not the best example, but I think you understand what I'm trying to get to. So at the beginning, you might need to do this for 2 minutes here, 1 minute there, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. Let's say 5, 10, 20 times a day. Eventually, it becomes a part of your life where you're always resting as awareness. You know that you are the soul, the spirit, the capital S self. You are awareness, capital A awareness, capital C consciousness. And so you don't need to practice so much. You don't need to meditate for 12 hours a day, because you already found what you're looking for, which is the true self, self-realized, to use that term where we started with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So one who is self-realized might still need to practice this technique or similar technique until you have become liberated, because being self-realized is not necessarily being liberated from suffering. So what I'm teaching is how to become liberated from suffering. And of course, because everything is determined, even that liberation is determined. So when Lord Buddha was enlightened or awakened, the word Buddha means awakened, when he was awakened, he may or may not have been liberated. That's a totally different thing. Liberated from suffering means to be fully liberated from all forms of suffering, not physical pain, as I said, but in the five forms of suffering or symptoms of suffering caused by belief in free will. So there are different concepts here: self-realization, liberation, awakening, enlightenment, and they're all rather different. They're not the same thing actually, which I don't have time to go into here. But the most important one, of course, is liberation. Like as I said, Mother Teresa could easily have been liberated from suffering, but it doesn't mean that she was the most enlightened person in history. Because she was praying to Lord Jesus all the time, assuming that she was, she could have become liberated from suffering by practicing devotional yoga, or bhakti yoga as it's called in India. So my therapy is focused on the most important aspects of life, is to become free of suffering, because we only have a short life. We could die at any minute. So before we die, let's experience the true peace that we are. So any final questions before we end here? Boris?
No. Sounds good.
Okay. So hopefully I'll see you sometime next week for our second session. Until then, have a very peaceful and pleasant week, full of lots of resting as awareness. Okay. Auf Wiedersehen. Okay, bye.